into the jungle, expecting nothing unusual. But what he found among the trees changed everything. A massive cruise ship stranded in the middle of the island, with no trace of crew and terrifying secrets inside. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this from. The sea had always been both a refuge and a wound for Marcus Lawson. It was the only place where silence felt honest, where the world shrank to a single horizon and a whisper of wind. For years he had wandered the coasts of forgotten lands, documenting relics of humanity that the modern age had left behind. Abandoned towns swallowed by sand, rusting vehicles buried under vines, factories half consumed by the jungle. Yet, nothing he had ever filmed had filled the emptiness that followed him like a shadow. The ocean, he thought, might still hold something untouched by lies, something that could make him feel alive again. When he stumbled upon the old maritime journal in a second-hand shop in Krabi, Thailand, it seemed like nothing more than another curiosity. The cover was eaten by salt and mildew, the pages stiff and yellowed. Most entries were routine. Coordinates, weather notes, cargo manifests from a decade long gone. But one page had a faint red mark, a hand-drawn circle with the numbers D47 written beside it. There was no island listed at that coordinate, no shipping route, no port. The name of the ship was illegible, blurred by time. Under the entry, written in pencil, were two words that caught his breath: Metal Shadow. Marcus spent nights hunched over digital maps, layering modern satellite images atop old navigation charts. There was indeed an anomaly, a blur on the radar, a distortion in the sea grid just north of the Andaman corridor. He scrolled through forums for maritime anomalies, and one thread, almost forgotten, mentioned that local fishermen sometimes saw a hill that disappears when you sail toward it. It was all rumor, half superstition. But to Marcus, who had built his new life around pursuing the improbable, it was enough. He booked a month of isolation. With his last savings, he bought equipment: waterproof cameras, drone batteries, a handheld radio, and a small solar charger. In the mirror of the cheap hostel, he studied his reflection, a tall, dark-skinned man in his early 40s, with eyes that looked older than his years. The scars on his hands were reminders of his past life as a mechanic, the calluses still fresh even after years away from the docks. Behind those eyes flickered the ghost of his son, gone before he could even finish high school. That loss was the reason Marcus never stayed in one place. He carried his guilt like luggage, always heavy, never claimed. The morning he left the mainland, the port was wrapped in gray mist. Boats creaked against their moorings and gulls screamed overhead like restless souls. He walked the docks until he found a man willing to rent him a fishing skiff, a weathered wooden vessel named Siam Pearl. The owner, a leathery-faced Thai man with more years behind him than teeth, shook his head when Marcus mentioned his destination. "No compass," the man said, tapping his temple. "Crazy place. Machines stop working there. You go, you don't come back." Marcus smiled faintly, thinking it was just superstition. He handed over the cash, packed his bags, and set off alone. For the first 2 days, the sea was calm. The hum of the outboard motor blended with the distant cries of seabirds. He recorded footage for his channel, speaking quietly into the camera. No land in sight, no signal, just the horizon breathing. At night, he slept under the open sky, rocked by gentle waves, lulled by the rhythm of water against wood. He dreamed of his son's laughter echoing in the engine room of an old cargo ship, the boy tracing his finger along maps and asking where the world ended. Marcus woke before dawn, his chest tight, the horizon still black. On the third day, the weather changed without warning. Clouds rolled in from the west like smoke from a burning sky. The wind grew sharp, biting, and soon the sea rose around him in walls of gray water. Lightning cracked open the world, and rain slammed against his skin like glass. The GPS flickered once, twice, then went black. The compass needle spun uselessly in circles. For hours he fought the current, trying to keep the bow pointed toward the waves, but the storm mocked his efforts. Eventually, he killed the engine and let the sea decide his path. By midnight, the wind had died. The silence was immense, broken only by the slow dripping of water from his clothes. Fog surrounded him, thick and luminous under the pale moonlight. Marcus checked his coordinates, zeros across the screen. The GPS refused to recognize his location. He sat in the dark, breathing the damp air, trying to convince himself that he hadn't made a terrible mistake. Then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the mist, came a low hum. It was not thunder, not the call of an engine. It was steady, metallic, almost like the deep vibration of a ship's hull beneath the waves. He leaned over the edge of the boat, peering into the fog. The water was unnaturally still, reflecting the moonlight like liquid glass. He thought he saw a shape, something vast and angular beneath the surface, but it vanished before he could focus. The hum continued for a few more seconds, then faded. Marcus rubbed his eyes and told himself it was exhaustion, perhaps the echo of the storm inside his skull. He started the engine again, following nothing but instinct, steering toward where the sound had been. By dawn, the fog thinned, revealing an outline on the horizon. At first, it looked like a mountain rising from the sea, but as the light grew stronger, the contours changed. It was too straight, too deliberate. A line of trees crept along its edge, and above them, a dark silhouette. He blinked, thinking his eyes deceived him, but the image sharpened. An island. It was not on any map he knew, yet there it was, real as the sun. The water near the shore grew shallow, littered with coral and fragments of old debris, rusted metal, cracked glass, splinters of wood. He cut the engine and let the tide carry the skiff until it scraped the sand. The island smelled of salt and decay. Vines hung like curtains over the shoreline, and thick mangrove roots twisted into the waves. As he stepped onto the beach, the sand sank beneath his boots, soft and black, almost oily. He pulled out his camera, speaking softly, his voice trembling despite himself. Day 4. Coordinates unknown. I've found land. Looks untouched. No signs of human life, but I think I hear something. He paused, listening. There it was again. The faint hum, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the ground. It wasn't the sound of insects or wind. It was mechanical, metallic, as though the island itself had a heartbeat. He walked inland, through the tangled undergrowth, every step sinking deeper into mud and leaves. The air was thick with humidity, filled with the scent of rot and sap. Strange birds called from somewhere high above, their cries echoing through the trees like laughter distorted by distance, while Marcus stopped to catch his breath and looked back toward the sea. His skiff was a small gray shape against the mist, barely visible. The realization hit him with quiet force. If the tide shifted, he might never find it again. Still, curiosity pulled him forward. He pushed aside the vines and saw something that didn't belong, a rusted metal post jutting from the earth, encrusted with salt and barnacles. A few steps farther and he found another and another. They formed a crooked line that led deeper into the forest, as if marking a forgotten path. The ground changed beneath his feet. It felt firmer, flatter. The jungle opened slightly, revealing what looked like the remains of a man-made surface, slabs of concrete cracked by roots covered with moss. He brushed away the leaves and saw a faint grid pattern, like the kind used on old piers. The hum grew louder now, pulsing through the air in intervals, steady and deep. He followed it until he reached a clearing, and then he froze. Rising before him, almost fused with the trees, was a wall of corroded steel. It towered above the canopy, streaked with rust and streaks of green algae. Vines clung to its surface like veins. He approached, his fingers trembling as he touched the cold metal. It vibrated faintly under his palm. He stepped back and looked upward. The surface curved, smooth and massive, disappearing into the foliage above. Then, half buried under roots, he saw it. The faded outline of a name painted in ghostly white letters. Aurora. The word sent a shiver through him. It was the name written in the old journal, the ship no one had heard of. But this couldn't be possible. The Aurora was a vessel, yet it stood here on solid land, its hull half swallowed by the island. How could a ship of that size have reached this place, surrounded by reefs and shallow waters? Marcus stepped back, filming the wall from different angles, his voice barely steady. It's a ship. A whole ship. It's here. God, it's huge. He found what remained of a staircase, metal steps twisted and crumbling. With effort, he climbed until he reached what might once have been the deck. The air grew cooler up there, and the sound of the jungle faded. The ship stretched across the island like a metal corpse, its bow buried under soil, its stern tilted toward the sea. Doors hung open on their hinges, and inside, darkness waited, patient and absolute. Marcus felt his heart pound, half from awe, half from fear. He switched on his flashlight and stepped through the nearest doorway. The beam cut through clouds of dust, revealing narrow corridors lined with peel-in wallpaper. A sign, in both Russian and English, read, "Passenger Deck D." Everything smelled of mold and salt. He ran his hand over the wall. The paint came off like ash. In one room, he found a child's toy, an old plastic elephant lying beside a cracked mirror. In another, a suitcase still latched shut. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside were clothes, neatly folded, untouched by time, and a passport. The photo was faded, the name written in Cyrillic, but the stamp was clear. December 2010. He lowered the passport, staring into the emptiness of the room. Dust motes swirled in the beam of his light, like memories refusing to settle. Outside, the hum had stopped. The air was heavy with stillness. Marcus turned off his camera and listened. The only sound was his own breathing, and, far away, something dripping steadily, like the heartbeat of the ship itself. He walked back toward the deck, trying to make sense of what he had found. The idea seemed impossible. A cruise liner, perfectly preserved, stranded in the heart of an island that wasn't supposed to exist. The map in his pocket suddenly felt meaningless. Whatever this place was, it didn't want to be found. As the sun sank behind the trees, Marcus stood on the tilted deck, staring toward the dark horizon. He had come searching for proof of life in forgotten places. Instead, he had found something that should not exist at all. The sea, calm once more, whispered against the shore as if mocking him. The fog began to rise again, swallowing the edges of the world. He turned off his light and whispered to the emptiness, "Tomorrow I'll go deeper." Behind him, deep inside the ship, something metal shifted, softly, almost like a sigh, and the island grew quiet again. The morning came without birdsong. The jungle lay heavy beneath a sky of dull silver, and the air pressed against Marcus's skin with the weight of wet cloth. He awoke in his small makeshift camp, surrounded by the half-submerged wreck of his supplies. camera cases, a damp notebook, the solar charger caked with mud. His clothes were still wet from the previous day's climb, and his hands ached from gripping the rusted ladder that had carried him up onto the ship's flank. The memories of the previous evening swirled like fog in his mind. Those endless corridors, the smell of decay and salt, the child's toy lying beside the mirror. The word Aurora still burned behind his eyes. He sat on a fallen tree trunk and drank a few sips of warm water from his flask. The taste of metal filled his mouth. Somewhere beyond the tree line, waves broke softly against the beach, though he could not see the sea anymore. The vegetation had swallowed the horizon overnight. The silence felt unnatural, as though the island were holding its breath. When he turned towards the ship, the sight of it almost made him doubt that it was real. The hull rose like a wall of rusted iron between the trees, a monstrous cliff streaked with salt and moss. In the gray light it seemed less like a man-made structure and more like a part of the island itself, grown out of the earth over centuries. Marcus packed his equipment and switched on the camera mounted on his chest. The small red light blinked. "Day 5, he whispered, his voice rasping. "Still on the island. The structure, if it is a ship, is larger than anything I've ever seen grounded. I'm going back inside." He hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the shore where his skiff lay hidden beyond the forest. For the first time, he wondered if he should mark the path, but he decided against it. The jungle seemed to rearrange itself every hour, and besides, something about this place made him feel that leaving a trail was dangerous, as if the island preferred to erase intruders. He retraced his steps to the same point where he had entered the ship the day before. The air changed as soon as he crossed the threshold, cooler, denser, almost sterile. The smell of rust was stronger now, mixed with something else, something sweet and foul like old fruit left in the sun. He moved slowly, his boots sinking into a carpet of decaying leaves that had drifted in through the broken portholes. Light filtered through cracks in the hull, painting long shafts across the corridor. In the dust that hung in the air, each beam looked solid, a frozen pillar of pale gold. The walls were covered with streaks of corrosion, but under the grime he could still make out patterns of decorative paneling, floral motifs, gold trimming, fragments of wallpaper showing scenes of tropical sunsets and dancing couples. The contrast between what the ship had once been and what it had become was jarring. Marcus stopped at one of the doors and gently pushed it open. Hinges groaned, and the smell of rot deepened. Inside was a cabin, a single bed, a small dresser, and a porthole clouded by green algae. On the desk lay a comb and a rusted fountain pen, beside which a glass still held the ghost of some long-evaporated liquid. The pen bore an inscription in Cyrillic letters. He wiped it clean and placed it carefully in his pocket. He moved from room to room, filming everything, his commentary low and deliberate. Everything is exactly as it was left. No signs of fire, no sign of flooding, no skeletons, just absence. In the dining hall he found tables still arranged in rows, covered in a thick layer of dust. Silverware was scattered across the floor, and one overturned chair lay in a pool of dried black mold. The chandelier above had lost most of its glass ornaments, but one strand remained intact and tinkled softly each time a breath of air passed through the hall. The sound echoed too long, like a bell underwater. A staircase led up to the next level. The steps were slick with moss, and he climbed carefully, clutching the rail. Halfway up he paused and shone his flashlight into the dark below. The beam revealed a shadow that flickered out of sight too quickly to be sure it was real. He stayed still, listening. Nothing but the distant creak of metal and the slow drip of condensation. He continued upward. The upper deck was partially exposed to the elements. Light poured through gaps in the collapsed ceiling, and vines hung from above like ropes. Birds had built nests in the rafters, though they were empty now. In one corner, he found what looked like a makeshift sleeping area: blankets, an old lantern, and a half-melted candle. The wax had pooled and hardened long ago. Someone, he realized, had been here after the ship ran aground. Perhaps a survivor who had tried to live here, or perhaps someone who came later for reasons unknown. He turned a corner and found himself facing a closed door painted white. Unlike the others, it was almost clean, the surface wiped of dust as if touched recently. A faded sign above it read, "Bridge Access Authorized Crew Only." His pulse quickened. The bridge might hold answers, navigation data, logs, maybe even a black box if such a thing had survived. He tried the handle. It resisted at first, then gave way with a shriek that made him flinch. The smell that greeted him was cold metal mixed with old paper and something faintly electric. The room was wide and lined with shattered windows, through which the jungle pressed its green fingers inside. The control panels stretched across one wall, covered in buttons and dials corroded by salt. Some of the labels were still legible: Engine 1, Auxiliary Power, Ballast Pumps. Dust coated everything, yet here and there faint scratches suggested that someone had moved through recently. The captain's chair, bolted to the floor, still faced the sea, though what lay beyond was now only forest. Marcus moved toward a desk at the back of the room. On it lay a leather-bound book. He touched the cover gently. It crumbled at the corners, but remained mostly intact. When he opened it, he felt disappointment surge. It was blank, every page an empty sheet. He turned them one by one, hoping for an imprint, a note, anything. Nothing. The logbook had never been used, or someone had deliberately removed its contents. He set it down carefully and examined the instruments around him. Most were dead, but one small light glowed faintly green on a panel near the window. He bent closer. The marking beside the bulb was written in Russian: Emergency Reserve. Power active. A thin hum vibrated through the metal beneath his hand, the same sound he had heard on the beach. Against all logic, some fragment of the ship's electrical system was still alive. He traced the wiring to a small generator tucked into a corner, half submerged in dried salt. Its casing was corroded, but the indicator light pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. He filmed it in silence, unsure what it meant. As he explored the bridge, something caught his eye near the captain's chair, a small metallic box lodged under a broken panel. He pulled it free. It was heavy, sealed with 4 rusted clasps. The surface bore no markings except for a faint serial number etched into the steel. He placed it on the table and hesitated. Curiosity battled with caution, but in the end curiosity won. With the blade of his multi-tool, he pried at the locks until they snapped. The lid lifted with a hiss of stale air. Inside was a thin stack of papers bound by a strip of fabric. Most were ruined by moisture, but one page remained legible. It contained a sequence of letters and numbers, too short for coordinates, too long for a serial tag. He frowned, whispering the code aloud. It sounded wrong in his mouth, like a language not meant to be spoken. He tucked the page into his jacket and turned off the camera for the first time that day. He stood in silence, letting the strange emptiness of the room press down on him. A decade had passed since this ship last moved, and yet it felt as if its story had only been paused, waiting for someone to resume it. He thought of the fisherman who had warned him not to come, of the old man's eyes when he had said, "Machines stop working there." But this machine hadn't stopped. It was still alive in some hidden way. By late afternoon, the light began to fade. The jungle outside was turning blue with shadow. Marcus decided to explore one more deck before returning to his camp. On the way down, he noticed details he hadn't seen before. A trail of scratches along the wall, as though something heavy had been dragged through the corridor. A broken glass panel on which someone had written a word with their finger. Perhaps help, though it was too smeared to be certain. He reached a lower section of the ship where the air grew damp again. The floor was uneven, warped by the weight of years. Here he found doors leading to storage rooms, some ajar, others sealed tight by corrosion. In one compartment, he discovered shelves lined with small canisters labeled in Cyrillic and English: lubricant, coolant, detergent. All were empty. The next room was darker, the flashlight beam catching a glint of metal on the far side. He stepped closer and saw an entire wall of lockers, their doors hanging open like mouths. Inside each was a single object: a shoe, a cap, a watch, a name tag. The personal belongings of crew members collected and left behind. There were too many for a routine evacuation. He filmed everything. His voice steady, but slower now, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might wake the ship. When he finally returned to the open deck, night had fallen. The jungle pulsed with the distant sound of insects, yet around the ship itself there was an eerie stillness, as if even the creatures avoided it. Marcus set up his small stove on the deck and boiled a can of beans, eating mechanically while reviewing the footage on his camera. The images flickered across the tiny screen. The bridge, the box, the symbols, but midway through the playback, static filled the display and the image froze. He tapped the camera. The screen went black. The battery indicator showed full. A tremor of unease rippled through him. He powered it off and stared into the darkness where the jungle met the hull. The fog was returning, curling low along the ground. The sound of dripping water came from somewhere deep within the ship. It was slow and regular, but now it was joined by another sound, softer, almost human. A faint thud followed by a scrape. It came from below the deck, from the bowels of the ship. Marcus rose slowly, flashlight in hand, and pointed it toward the stairwell. The beam reached only darkness. He told himself it was metal contracting as the temperature dropped, a normal phenomenon. He had heard it countless times on old vessels, but the rhythm of the sound did not match metal stress. It was deliberate, spaced, too much like footsteps. He waited, counting the intervals. After a while, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was worse. He remained there for several minutes, gripping the flashlight before convincing himself to retreat. He packed his gear, descended carefully to the ground, and made his way back through the forest to his camp. The path seemed shorter this time, or perhaps the island had shifted around him. At one point, he thought he heard the hum again, the deep metallic vibration that had led him here, but it was faint and quickly swallowed by the wind. When he reached the beach, the skiff was still there, half buried in sand. He sank to his knees beside it, exhausted, and stared back toward the tree line. The glow of the flashlight in his hand trembled. Behind the curtain of vines, he could just make out the silhouette of the Aurora's hull looming against the sky. For a moment, it seemed to move, expanding slightly as though drawing breath. Then it was still. He turned off the light and lay back on the sand, staring at the blank sky. The sound of the waves should have been comforting, but each surge carried with it that low resonance, the ship's heartbeat, faint but steady. Marcus closed his eyes and listened until he drifted into uneasy sleep. The last thing he thought before darkness took him was that the island wasn't merely hiding the ship, it was keeping it alive. And tomorrow he would have to find out why. The dawn that followed was a pale and reluctant thing, a thin light filtering through a mist so dense it seemed to muffle sound itself. Marcus woke with the uneasy feeling that he had been watched all night. The fog hung low over the beach, swallowing the outlines of the trees and the great shadow of the ship beyond them. The hum he had heard before was gone, replaced by the slow, rhythmic breathing of the sea. For a long while, he sat in silence beside his half-buried skiff, staring at the direction of the forest, where the faint silhouette of the aurora rose like the ribcage of a dead titan. His body was heavy with fatigue, but curiosity, or perhaps obsession, pulled him to his feet. He could not leave. The ship haunted his thoughts like a half-remembered dream, whispering questions that demanded answers. What had happened to the people who once filled those rooms? Why had the ship come to rest here, hundreds of miles from any known shipping route? He told himself that one more day of exploration would be enough. He could collect samples, finish filming, and then make his way back to the mainland with evidence. It sounded reasonable, but the truth was simpler. He needed to see more. The forest greeted him in silence as he made his way back to the ship. Dew clung to every leaf, and the smell of decay had deepened overnight, a mix of wet metal and rotting vegetation. When he reached the hull, he noticed details he had missed before. Markings carved into the rust, perhaps initials or numbers, though some looked more like scratches made in desperation. He ran his fingers across one of them and felt the faint indentation of a human fingernail. Climbing the corroded staircase again, he reached the deck where the air was cooler and still. The fog here was thinner, revealing the jungle canopy stretching to the horizon. For a moment, the sight was almost beautiful. Then his gaze drifted towards the broken windows of the upper cabins, and the beauty dissolved into unease. The emptiness inside seemed darker today, more deliberate, as if the ship were hiding something. He began filming once more, narrating quietly into his camera. The aurora remains structurally stable. No visible signs of major impact. Whatever happened here didn't sink her. It left her stranded. His voice was calm, but his hands trembled slightly as he opened the first door of the day. The corridor behind it was lined with passenger cabins, their numbers still faintly visible on tarnished plaques. Each door opened into a world frozen mid-breath. One cabin had a half-packed suitcase lying on the bed, shirts neatly folded, a pair of sunglasses resting on top. In another, a chessboard sat on a small table, the pieces arranged mid-game. White's queen was poised to strike. Dust covered everything in a uniform gray coat, yet the scene remained disturbingly intact, as if the players had stepped out for a moment and never returned. Marcus took note of the details, filming slowly. The air was heavy, charged with the faint hum of distant machinery, perhaps the same auxiliary system he had discovered on the bridge. It should not have been possible after so many years. He switched off the camera for a moment and listened. Beneath the soft creaks of the hull, he could almost hear something else, a rhythmic clicking, like the pulse of an engine still struggling to breathe. Further down the corridor, he found what had once been a lounge. Dust-covered armchairs faced a wall of shattered windows that looked out onto the forest beyond. A piano stood in the corner, its keys yellowed with age, but surprisingly intact. He brushed the dust from the lid and hesitated before lifting it. The strings were rusted, yet when his fingers pressed down, a faint note escaped, a low, hollow sound that echoed through the empty room. The noise startled him, not because it was loud, but because it felt impossibly alive. He turned, scanning the shadows, half expecting to see movement, but there was only the whisper of air through broken glass. He laughed softly to himself, though the sound died quickly in his throat. "Just the ship," he murmured, as if to reassure it. He crossed to the far wall, where faded posters still clung to the paneling. They advertised entertainment shows, ballroom dances, a magic act, a Christmas gala. The dates stopped abruptly in December 2010, confirming what the passport had already suggested. Something had happened then. Something final. He lowered his camera, noting how quickly the dust seemed to reclaim everything he touched, erasing his presence as though the ship refused to be disturbed. As he explored deeper, he noticed a peculiar order to the chaos. The dining hall he entered next was eerily symmetrical. Every chair was pushed neatly under the tables. Plates were stacked at precise angles. Even the silverware glimmered faintly under the beam of his flashlight, arranged as if awaiting service. It was too tidy, too deliberate. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. Someone, or something, had been here after the passengers vanished. He tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a salvage crew had come through years ago, cleaning up for reasons unknown. But if that were true, why was there no sign of disturbance outside? No footprints, no recent damage, no tools or supplies left behind. He turned his light toward the far end of the hall and froze. There, near the wall, something had been etched into the surface with a sharp object. He moved closer and read the words slowly. They never left. The letters were uneven, carved deep into the wood. Beneath them, faint grooves extended downward, scratch marks, hundreds of them as though made by desperate hands. Marcus stepped back, his breath shallow. His light caught another set of markings nearby, this time smaller, more chaotic. At first he thought they were random, but when he looked closer, he realized they formed words in Russian. He didn't understand most of it, but one phrase repeated again and again. Zakrili dveri. They closed the doors. He turned off the flashlight and stood in the half-light filtering through the cracked windows. The air seemed to vibrate faintly. His own heartbeat echoed in his ears, loud and unsteady. He had seen many abandoned places, but never one that felt this inhabited. Pulling himself away from the wall, he moved toward the rear of the hall, where a set of double doors led down another staircase. The steps descended into darkness, their edges slick with moisture. He hesitated at the top, then forced himself to continue. The narrow passageway below smelled of salt and rust, with a faint undertone of something organic. Mildew, perhaps, or something worse. The corridor opened into what appeared to be a recreational deck, once lined with shops and display cases. Most were shattered, their glass littering the floor like frost. Behind one counter lay a collection of souvenirs. Miniature ship models, postcards, and T-shirts sealed in plastic. All of them bore the Aurora's insignia, a sun rising over calm waves. The irony stung him. At the far end of the deck, he found an elevator shaft, the doors pried open. Inside, a ladder descended into the lower levels, into what he guessed must be the crew's quarters, or perhaps the cargo hold. The hum he had heard earlier seemed louder here, resonating through the steel walls. He switched on his camera again. "I'm going down," he said, his voice barely a whisper. The descent was slow, the ladder was slippery, and every rung groaned under his weight. The air grew colder with each meter, the light dimmer. When he finally reached the bottom, His flashlight revealed a long, low corridor lined with pipes. Water dripped steadily from above, forming small puddles that mirrored the beam of his light. He advanced cautiously, filming as he went. Doors branched off on either side: crew quarters, storage rooms, maintenance closets. In one, he found a row of bunk beds, the mattresses reduced to skeletons of fabric and wire. Personal belongings lay scattered: a pair of work gloves, a canteen, a paperback novel whose pages had fused together with mold. On the wall, someone had drawn a crude calendar, the last date circled in black ink: December 14th, 2010. He felt the hairs on his neck rise. Whatever happened aboard this ship, it had happened fast. There had been no evacuation, no order, no attempt to clean or salvage. It was as if the entire crew had simply vanished in a single moment, leaving their lives mid-motion. As he continued forward, the corridor took a sharp turn and opened into a larger chamber. It was the engine control room, or what remained of it. Machinery filled the space, immense and silent, coated with rust. Yet, among the lifeless engines, one panel still emitted a faint green light, pulsing in rhythm. He approached, mesmerized. The control board was partially submerged in stagnant water, but a few indicators blinked stubbornly. The auxiliary power unit again. Somehow, against all logic, it was still operating. He raised his camera, speaking into it softly. The power systems are partially functional. I can't explain it. No visible source of fuel, no external connection. It's as if the ship doesn't know it's dead. He trailed off, realizing how absurd that sounded, yet the idea refused to leave him. Then he noticed something on the floor near the base of the console, a pattern of footprints, faint but unmistakable, leading toward a door on the far side of the room. The prints were wet, as though made moments ago. He knelt down, touching the surface. The water was cold, too cold. His flashlight flickered once, and in that instant he thought he saw a shadow move beyond the doorway, tall and slow. He called out instinctively, "Hello?" The echo that came back was distorted, warped by the metal walls. When he stepped closer, the light steadied, revealing only emptiness. The door led into another narrow passageway, this one ending abruptly in a sealed bulkhead. On its surface, someone had painted a single word in red, smeared and almost gone. He could make out only 3 letters: D-E-C. December, perhaps. Marcus stood there for a long time, the air thick with the smell of rust and something faintly chemical. He felt both fear and fascination, 2 forces pulling him deeper into the ship's story. It wasn't just abandonment. There had been order here, routine, even after disaster. Someone had kept the lights burning, however dimly, long after everyone else was gone. When he finally climbed back toward the upper decks, the sun had already set. The corridors were darker now, the thin emergency lights casting long shadows across the walls. He stopped in front of a mirror in one of the passenger cabins, raising his flashlight. The glass was cracked, reflecting his face in fragments. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw another reflection beside his own, a figure standing just behind him. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Only the soft echo of his movement returned by the empty hall. He shut off the camera and stood still, letting the darkness press against him. The ship groaned faintly, as if stretching in its sleep. Somewhere far below, he thought he heard the drip of water again, steady as a heartbeat. When he stepped out onto the deck at last, the fog had thickened, swallowing the jungle and even the sky. The aurora loomed around him like a cathedral of rust and sorrow. Marcus leaned against the railing, exhausted, watching the mist curl across the meadow. For a moment, he imagined the passengers returning to their places, the dancers in the ballroom, the children running down the corridors, laughter echoing off the walls. He could almost hear them, faint and distant. But when he blinked, the vision was gone, leaving only the hollow sound of the wind. The ship was empty again, but the emptiness felt fragile, as if something unseen waited just beyond the edges of light. He turned back toward the door, whispering to himself, "Tomorrow I'll go further down. There has to be something left that explains this." The mist coiled around his feet as he descended the stairs, and behind him, in the silence of the dining hall, the chandelier gave one last trembling chime, as though the ship were sighing in its sleep. The fog never lifted that morning. It thickened instead, swallowing the shoreline and muffling the crash of waves until the island seemed to exist inside a giant lung, breathing in slow and uneven rhythm. Marcus awoke to the sound of condensation dripping onto the canvas of his small tent, each drop echoing like a slow, deliberate clock. For a few minutes he lay still, eyes open, listening to the pulse of moisture, trying to remember where he was. Then it came back. The ship. The name painted across the hall, the eerie order of the empty dining room, and those words carved into the wall. They never left. He rose, stretching sore limbs, and stepped out into the damp air. The world was colorless except for the green sheen of the jungle, slick and glistening under the mist. The aurora loomed behind the trees like a ghost caught mid-breath, its rusted hull fading in and out of sight as the fog shifted. Every part of him screamed to leave, to take the skiff and push out to sea while there was still fuel left in the tank. But another part, the stubborn, hungry part that had always driven him toward ruins and forgotten places, kept him rooted. He had come too far to turn back without understanding what had happened here. The ship was silent when he approached. Even the familiar groan of metal expanding in the heat had stopped, as though it too was waiting. Climbing the ladder again felt like ascending into the belly of some sleeping creature. The steel was slick beneath his hands, and the smell of salt had deepened, mixed with the faint reek of something organic and stale, like a wet cellar that had been sealed for years. Inside, the light from his flashlight stretched into long, trembling beams. Dust motes swam through the air, disturbed only by his breath. He started toward the lower decks again, retracing his steps through the corridor where the piano had stood silent the day before. The lid was still open, but the keys were gone, stripped out sometime during the ship's long decay. He wondered if someone had scavenged them or if they had simply fallen apart. As he descended into the crew quarters, the temperature dropped sharply. The walls sweated condensation and the floor was slick with thin algae. The smell grew stronger here, oil, rust, and something earthy beneath it, the smell of things that had once been alive and were now long dead. Marcus's boots squelched with each step, leaving shallow prints in the grime. He passed rows of bunks again, each one as he had left it. Half-collapsed mattresses, mildewed sheets, and objects that spoke of lives interrupted. A half-written letter lay on one of the bunks, the ink smeared but still legible enough to make out a few words. "We are not told anything." He found the maintenance room where the dripping water echoed most clearly, a rhythmic tap from a broken pipe. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the floor and it caught on something metallic, half buried beneath rust flakes and soggy paper. It was a small tin box, sealed shut with two clasps. Marcus knelt and brushed away the grime. The lid bore faint Cyrillic lettering, and though most of it had corroded away, One word remained readable: Kuknia, kitchen. His pulse quickened. The box must have belonged to a member of the ship's galley staff. He wedged his knife beneath one of the clasps and pried it open. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in plastic film, browned and stiff with age. He peeled it back carefully, revealing a notebook, its pages swollen with moisture but still intact enough to hold writing. The ink had bled in many places, but between the blurred stains he could make out paragraphs, names, and dates. The handwriting was uneven but firm. On the inside cover was a name written twice: I. Pablenko. He sat back against the wall, adjusting the beam of his flashlight to read. The first entries were ordinary: lists of ingredients, notes on mealtimes, small complaints about the heat and the noise of the engines. Pablenko had been a cook, or perhaps a kitchen assistant. The man's tone was weary but good-humored, often mentioning other crew members by name. Sergei sings when he chops onions, or the captain doesn't eat with us but he watches everything. As Marcus turned the damp pages, the tone changed. The handwriting grew smaller, tighter, as though written in haste or fear. We're loading something again tonight. One entry read. They don't tell us what. Heavy crates, no markings, only numbers. They work all night. The passengers must not see. Another page was smeared with ink, the words nearly lost. Strange smell coming from the lower deck. Not fish, not oil. I don't go near it. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He turned to the next page. The date was December 9th, 2010. The captain received a radio call. Orders changed. We are not going to Singapore. We are going to coordinates D47. Crew confused, some angry. They say we have no reason to change route. The entry ended abruptly, the last words pressed deep into the paper as though the pen had snapped. He continued reading, his pulse quickening. Passengers are restless. We serve them as if nothing is wrong, but some of the staff whisper about sickness. One woman fainted in the dining hall yesterday. Captain says it is only heat, but the weather is not hot. The sea is still. The air feels heavy. Another page followed, written more shakily. The engines stopped for 3 hours last night. I heard shouting near the cargo hold. When I tried to go see, a man from the bridge blocked my way. He said it was off limits. Later, I heard hammering, like they were sealing something. Marcus read until his eyes ached from the strain of deciphering the faded ink. The last legible entries were frantic, fragmented thoughts scattered across the pages. They locked the crew below. Say it is a quarantine. But we are not sick. I saw them loading weapons, not for us. For someone else? Sergei gone. No one will talk to me. The captain has the key. The very last page bore only a few shaky lines, written as though the man could barely hold the pen. They close the doors. I hear them above. No engines now, only silence. If someone finds this, we did not drown. We were left here. Marcus stared at the words for a long time, his mind struggling to absorb their weight. The air seemed to grow thicker around him, pressing on his chest. The silence of the ship suddenly felt heavier, filled with unseen memory. He imagined Pablenko sitting in this very corridor, writing by the light of a lantern while the ship above him sealed itself shut, the hum of the engines fading into death. He packed the notebook carefully into his waterproof bag. His camera recorded his commentary, his voice low and unsteady. The crew was locked below deck, possibly under orders. The ship may have been transporting something classified. The name Pablenko appears repeatedly. He believed they were abandoned intentionally. This could explain why no distress signal was ever logged. When he stood, his legs trembled. He looked down the corridor and thought he saw movement, a flicker, like a shadow crossing between doorways. He froze, listening. Nothing. The only sound was the steady drip of water. He told himself it was a trick of the light and started toward the stairwell. But the feeling of being watched followed him all the way up, like the breath of the ship itself moving just behind his shoulder. On the upper deck, the fog had found its way inside. It curled through the hallways in pale ribbons, carrying the faint smell of salt and decay. Marcus walked toward the ballroom again, needing space and air, but when he entered, his breath caught. Across the floor, carved into the dust with something sharp, were new marks. They hadn't been there before. He crouched and examined them under his flashlight. The scratches formed a single word in crooked English letters. Wait. He stood motionless, the beam of his light trembling. Someone, or something, had been here since yesterday. His mind leapt through possibilities. Wind, debris, perhaps even some animal moving through the corridors. Yet the word was deliberate, formed with purpose. He felt a surge of adrenaline, part fear, part fascination. The Aurora was not dead. He forced himself to think rationally. Perhaps a survivor, some hermit living unseen in the depths of the island, had taken shelter here. It wasn't impossible. He would need to search the lower decks again, but the thought of going back into that darkness filled him with dread. He decided to return to the bridge instead, to see if the ship's communication logs still existed. Maybe he could find evidence that matched Pavlenko's account. The climb to the bridge felt endless. The metal stairs groaned under his weight, and the air grew colder as he ascended. When he reached the top, the world outside the windows was a blur of gray. The trees were gone, hidden beneath the fog. Inside, everything was as he had left it. The captain's chair facing the void, the control panel silent except for that one green light pulsing like a heartbeat. He approached it, listening. Beneath the hum, another sound emerged, faint but distinct. A low knocking, rhythmic and steady, coming from deep within the hull. 3 short beats, then 2 long. It repeated twice before fading. He whispered aloud, "Morse." His mind scrambled for memory. 3 short, 2 long. It wasn't a standard distress code, but it was a pattern, a message from somewhere inside the ship. His hands shook as he grabbed the handheld radio from his pack and switched it on, scanning frequencies. Static filled the air. Then, faintly, a sound, a weak signal, repeating the same pattern of knocks, though now distorted into bursts of white noise. He listened for nearly a minute before it disappeared completely. The radio went dead. He tapped it, adjusted the dial, but the screen remained blank. For a moment, he thought of leaving, of grabbing his things and fleeing back to the skiff. But the pull of the unknown was stronger than his fear. If Pavlenko had been telling the truth, if the ship had indeed been sealed from above, then maybe that knocking was his final echo, still looping through the ship's decaying systems after all these years. He turned off the radio and sat in the captain's chair. The fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, distorting the light. For a long time, he stared into it, feeling the vibration of the ship beneath him, soft, almost imperceptible, but real. The Aurora was still alive, still humming with secrets. When he finally rose, the day had already faded into twilight. The bridge glowed faintly under the green pulse of the emergency light. Marcus packed the notebook away and whispered to the empty room, "I'll find the cargo hold tomorrow." His voice echoed once and died. As he descended toward the lower decks, the hum grew louder, blending with the sound of the sea beyond the hull. The ship seemed to breathe with him now, matching his steps, a rhythm both ancient and human. Somewhere deep inside that vast metal carcass, the truth waited, buried beneath rust, silence, and time. When he reached the bottom of the stairwell, a draft of air brushed past his face, carrying with it a faint whisper that might have been words or might have been the sea. He couldn't tell which. He switched off the flashlight for a moment and let the darkness fold around him. It was absolute, heavy, yet strangely familiar. And as the ship settled back into stillness, Marcus knew that what he had read in Pavlenko's trembling handwriting was not a relic of the past. It was a warning that still lived in the steel around him, waiting for the next hand, brave or foolish enough to open its doors. Night came to the island like a tide of ink, slow and heavy, swallowing the outlines of trees and the faint gleam of the sea. Marcus sat beside his small fire on the beach, the smoke rising in thin blue ribbons before vanishing into the fog that hung low over the ground. The flames did little to chase away the chill that had settled into his bones, nor the unease that had crept steadily into his mind since reading Pavlenko's journal. The man's final words played over and over in his thoughts. They closed the doors. We did not drown. We were left here. Each time Marcus looked towards the dark silhouette of the aurora, his pulse quickened. The ship loomed at the edge of the jungle like a wound that refused to heal, its rusted body glowing faintly under the reflection of his firelight. He told himself he would leave in the morning, that the footage he had gathered was enough, that no discovery was worth the growing sense of dread that clung to him. But as he sat there, the faint mechanical hum returned, vibrating through the sand beneath him, distant yet unmistakable. It was coming from the ship, from deep within her belly. The sound rose and fell like a slow heartbeat. Marcus stood before he realized he was moving, his camera slung over his shoulder, flashlight trembling in his hand. He told himself that he would only look, that he needed one final confirmation before leaving. The forest was quieter than ever as he made his way through it, the fog drifting between the trunks like smoke from a hidden fire. His breath came in shallow bursts. When he reached the hall, the sound was louder, more distinct now, a low, continuous vibration, mechanical yet alive. He climbed the corroded ladder once more, his hands slipping on the damp rungs. Inside, the corridors of the aurora were darker than he remembered, as though the shadows themselves had thickened overnight. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dust and mist, catching glimpses of familiar objects, the piano lid half closed, the rows of chairs in perfect alignment, the word wait still etched into the floor where he had found it. Everything was unchanged, yet everything felt altered. The air was heavier, the silence thicker. He thought he could hear faint whispers traveling through the metal walls, but when he stopped to listen, there was nothing. He followed the sound downward, through narrow stairwells that twisted like the arteries of a great beast. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling, and each drop echoed through the empty halls like the ticking of a clock. The smell of rust was sharp now, tinged with something acrid and chemical. He recognized it from his years as a mechanic, the scent of industrial lubricants and machinery coolant. It was stronger here, as though something beneath the decks was leaking into the walls themselves. The stairwell ended in a narrow corridor he hadn't explored before. The passage was partially flooded, a thin layer of stagnant water reflecting the beam of his light. The floor was littered with debris, bits of twisted wire, fragments of glass, and a few scraps of paper that disintegrated when he touched them. At the far end stood a heavy metal door, its surface marked with yellow symbols. hazard signs, faded and almost erased by time. One was the universal symbol for radiation, the trefoil barely visible beneath a crust of rust. Marcus's heart pounded as he stepped closer. The door was secured by a thick steel wheel that had been locked in place with a chain and padlock, though both were corroded. He hesitated, the rational part of his mind screaming for him to turn back. But the rest of him, the part that had chased ghost ships and sunken stories across half the world, would not be denied. He set down his camera and pulled the multi-tool from his belt. With effort, he wedged the blade between the chain links and twisted. The brittle metal snapped with a sharp crack that echoed down the corridor. The wheel resisted at first, then slowly began to turn. A hiss escaped from the edges of the door as it shifted, the stale air within rushing out in a cold wave that smelled of oil and dust. Marcus coughed, covering his mouth, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, stretching far wider than the corridors he had seen above. His flashlight illuminated rows of large metal containers stacked 2 or 3 high, each one secured with thick steel bands. Many had burst open, their lids bent outward like the shells of crushed beetles. Others remained sealed but bore strange markings, numbers, letters, symbols that had been scratched away or painted over. Some still glistened faintly, as if coated with an oily residue. Marcus stepped carefully between them, his boots splashing through shallow puddles. The air here was colder still, heavy with the tang of metal and something bitter that made his throat sting. On one of the open crates, he could still make out a fragment of a label, property of Baltic Maritime Group. His stomach turned at the name. He remembered it from the old news articles he had read years ago. A shipping company accused of illegally transporting toxic waste between Asia and Eastern Europe before disappearing amid scandal. The lawsuits, the missing records, the rumors of lost ships, all of it came rushing back. The Aurora had not been a cruise liner. It had been a mask, a vessel for something far darker. He filmed slowly, documenting every detail. "The cargo hold is filled with sealed containers," he said softly into the microphone. "Most are unmarked, but some bear the logo of a defunct maritime company involved in chemical transport. It appears the ship was used to smuggle hazardous materials. The logs we found, Pavlenko's journal, suggest the crew may have discovered this and were locked below to keep them silent." His voice trembled slightly, but he forced himself to continue. "Whatever was in these crates is gone now. Someone came back for it." At the far end of the hold, a second door stood partially ajar. Faint light flickered beyond it, not the reflection of his flashlight, but a pale, unnatural glow. He moved toward it, every step measured. The light grew stronger as he approached, pulsing softly in rhythm with the deep hum that filled the air. He reached the doorway and stopped. Beyond it lay another chamber, smaller and half collapsed. The source of the light was a bank of machinery still functioning in some impossible way, small generators connected by thick cables that disappeared into the floor. A single monitor blinked faintly, its screen cracked but alive, showing lines of text that scrolled endlessly in a language he couldn't decipher. He stepped closer, watching as the screen flickered, the letters dissolving into static and then reforming. He reached out to touch the keyboard and the hum deepened, reverberating through the floor and into his bones. A burst of static filled the room, followed by a faint voice, distorted, mechanical, but unmistakably human. "Do not open, hold, sealed, contamination risk." The message looped twice before cutting off. Marcus froze, his breath caught in his throat. The voice was old, the recording degraded, but the warning was clear. contamination. Whatever the Aurora had carried, it had been dangerous enough to warrant sealing the entire crew below deck. He glanced at the generators, still humming after more than a decade, feeding power to systems that should have long since died. It made no sense, unless someone had maintained them, unless someone had returned. He backed away slowly, the light of the screen reflecting off the surface of the flooded floor. That was when he noticed it. More containers, smaller, stacked against the far wall. Unlike the others, these were marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The paint was faded, but the shapes were precise, geometric, almost mathematical, repeating patterns of triangles and circles. A few of the containers had been pried open. Inside, he could see fragments of glass, broken vials, and shredded plastic sheeting. The stench was overpowering, sharp enough to make his eyes water. He turned to leave, but something caught his foot. Looking down, he saw a half-submerged briefcase wedged between two crates. It was leather, soaked and cracking with age, but still sealed by a clasp. He pulled it free, the movement stirring up dark ripples across the puddle. When he opened it, his light fell on a collection of passports, each bearing the Aurora's emblem. Crew identification cards, licenses, and a handful of photographs spilled onto the floor. The faces stared up at him, frozen in time, smiling without knowing their fate. At the bottom of the case lay a smaller notebook, waterlogged but readable. He flipped through it, recognizing Pavlenko's handwriting again. These were notes he hadn't seen before. Brief, desperate entries scrawled in the margins of what looked like a supply manifest. "They told us it was medicine," one line read. "Said we were heroes helping during a crisis. But this is no medicine, smells like acid, burns the air." Another page. "They came at night, loaded boxes while passengers slept. Captain said not to ask questions. I think he knew." And then, near the end, barely legible, "The men in suits, foreign, not from our company. They left the ship, and then the engines stopped. I think they did this on purpose." Marcus closed the notebook, his hands trembling. Everything fit. The secrecy, the sudden change in course, the silence of the outside world when he tried to contact authorities. The Aurora had been a ghost before it even died, erased from records the moment it became inconvenient. The company, the government, someone had wanted it to disappear, to sink without a trace. But instead, it had found this island, and whoever tried to bury its story had left their evidence behind. A metallic clang echoed through the hold, sharp and close. Marcus froze, light sweeping across the room. The sound came again. From above this time, near the stairwell he had descended earlier. Something was moving on the deck above. He turned off his flashlight, plunging the room into darkness except for the dim glow of the dying monitor. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly, slow and deliberate, crossing the metal floor overhead. He waited, barely breathing. Then silence. When he finally dared to move again, the light from the monitor flickered violently, as though reacting to some unseen interference. The hum deepened, becoming a low growl that shook the walls. A trickle of water fell from the ceiling, followed by another, then another, until a fine mist filled the air. The ship seemed to shudder beneath his feet. He grabbed his camera and turned to leave, but the path back to the corridor was filling with water, now seeping from the seams of the bulkhead. The Aurora was groaning again, alive with motion. He sprinted through the rising water, heart pounding, slipping once and catching himself on a rusted pipe. The air felt charged, thick with static. He climbed the stairwell 2 steps at a time, ignoring the burning in his legs. Behind him, the hum rose to a deafening roar, and for an instant he thought he heard voices again. Hundreds of them whispering over one another, echoing through the steel. When he reached the upper deck, he burst into the open air, gasping. The fog had thickened so much that he could see only a few meters ahead. The ship's hull vibrated under his hands. It was not the steady heartbeat of before, but a feverish, erratic tremor. Somewhere, deep within, the machines he had found were still running, feeding power into the veins of a vessel that refused to die. Marcus stumbled toward the edge of the deck, clutching the rail. The sea below was black, still as glass. For a moment, he thought he saw light beneath the surface, pale shapes moving slowly, as if the ship's reflection had come alive. He blinked, and they were gone. He stayed there until the tremors subsided and the silence returned, broken only by his ragged breathing. When he finally looked down at his hands, he saw that they were streaked with a thin gray residue, metallic and faintly luminous under the dim light. He wiped them on his jacket, his heart hammering. Whatever had been stored in that cargo hold was still seeping into the ship, into the air, into him. He made his way back toward the forest, every instinct screaming that he should leave, that the island was not a place meant for the living. Yet, as he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't seen everything, that somewhere beneath the decks, behind one of those sealed bulkheads, there was still something left. Not just evidence, but a truth that refused to stay buried. By the time he reached his camp, dawn had begun to pale the sky. The fire had gone out. His camera's battery light blinked weakly, but it had recorded everything. The crates, the labels, the generators, even the voice. Marcus sank to his knees beside the skiff, staring back at the ship through the thinning fog. The Aurora stood silent again, motionless against the lightening horizon. Yet, even from this distance, he could still hear it faintly. The hum, low and steady, like a heart beating deep within the island's chest. He realized then that the ship would never let him go. The day that followed felt unreal, stretched thin and hollow, as if time itself had become reluctant to move forward. The sky remained overcast, the light a dim wash of gray that filtered weakly through the jungle canopy. Marcus barely noticed the passage of hours. His mind replayed the events of the previous night in looping fragments. The rusted door, the glowing monitors, the voice warning him not to open the hold, and above all the hum, that deep mechanical pulse that had shaken the ship like a heartbeat. He spent most of the morning sitting near his extinguished fire, staring at the Aurora. The ship stood silent once again, its enormous frame half veiled in mist, as though it had grown roots in the earth overnight. He tried to convince himself that he had imagined the tremors, that what he'd witnessed had been nothing more than decaying machinery responding to a shift in temperature or pressure. But the residue on his hands told another story. It had not washed away easily, leaving faint gray stains that seemed to shimmer when they caught the light. He told himself it was dust, metallic sediment from the corroded hull, but the thought refused to settle. By noon, he decided he would leave. He said it aloud to himself, as though speaking the words could make them true. He would record one last segment, a summary for his documentary, then take the skiff out to sea before nightfall. He packed his gear methodically, wiping the lenses of his cameras, checking his batteries. The work steadied him. Yet, each time he looked up, the ship seemed to beckon, silent and watchful, its dark windows staring down like hollow eyes. The rational part of him knew it was dangerous to return. The part that had driven him this far Stubborn, reckless, curious, knew he would never forgive himself if he left now, with the mystery still half buried. The light was fading by the time he made up his mind. He would go aboard one last time, document the upper decks, capture the sunset from the bridge, and then leave before full darkness. That was the promise he made to himself. But promises mean little when made to things that cannot answer. The jungle swallowed him as he walked toward the ship. Every sound seemed amplified, the whisper of leaves underfoot, the distant cry of unseen birds, the faint rustle of wind against the vines. When he reached the hall, the metal was cold to the touch, as though it had absorbed none of the day's warmth. The air smelled of iron and damp earth. He climbed the ladder slowly, every creak of rusted metal echoing through the stillness. Inside, the corridors were darker than before. The fog had crept into the ship through broken windows and open doors, hanging in thin wisps that caught the beam of his flashlight. He felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as though he were walking through a memory rather than a place. The rooms were unchanged. The same tables, the same overturned chair, the same piano lid half open as if waiting for a player who would never return. Yet there was something different in the air, a quiet tension as if the ship were holding its breath. He made his way to the upper deck. The sky beyond the shattered windows was deepening to indigo, streaked with the faint red of the setting sun. He set up his camera near the railing and filmed the horizon. "Final log," he began, his voice low but steady. "This will be my last recording on the Aurora. Evidence suggests the vessel was used to transport hazardous materials under the guise of a passenger liner. The crew may have discovered the operation and been silenced. I found containers marked with radiation warnings and a logbook from one of the cooks, Pablenko, suggesting they were locked below deck. The ship remains partially powered by unknown means. I can't explain it. The systems are functioning decades beyond their operational lifespan. If anyone finds this footage, the coordinates are stored in my GPS. This place should not exist." He stopped recording and lowered the camera. The silence pressed against him. In the distance, thunder rolled faintly across the water, though the air remained still. He looked down at the deck where a thin film of moisture reflected the fading light. It shimmered faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though the metal itself were breathing. He stepped closer and realized the vibrations were back, gentle, steady, like a pulse. His first thought was that one of the generators below had restarted, perhaps triggered by a shift in the electrical systems. But then he remembered the way the ship had groaned the night before, the tremors that had run through the decks. He should have left then. Now, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, the hum deepened. It seemed to rise from every surface around him, the railings, the walls, even the air itself. He tried to shake the feeling. He would go to the bridge, pack up his tripod, and leave. That was all. But the sound followed him as he walked, resonating through the floor, faint but inescapable. When he reached the bridge, the faint green light on the control panel was still pulsing. The screen that had once shown gibberish text was now black. The reflection of his flashlight glimmered across the cracked glass. He turned the light away and stood still, listening. The hum had changed pitch, slower now, almost rhythmic, like a chant heard through walls. Then came the footsteps. At first, they were soft, distant, somewhere below him. He froze, straining to hear. They grew clearer, moving along the lower deck, metal against metal, deliberate and unhurried. Someone, or something, was walking through the corridors of the Aurora. He turned off his flashlight and held his breath. The footsteps paused, then continued, ascending the stairwell. Panic surged through him. He backed away from the door, gripping the flashlight tightly, his other hand fumbling for the camera. The idea that another person might be aboard should have comforted him, but instead it filled him with dread. Whoever was here had moved in silence for days. He had found no trace of recent habitation, no supplies, no sign of life. The rational mind tried to conjure explanations, a lost fisherman, a scavenger, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. The footsteps stopped again, just outside the bridge door. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. Then the door handle twitched. Once, twice. A slow, scraping sound followed, metal grinding against metal, as if the rusted hinges were being tested. Marcus's breath came in shallow bursts. He flicked on the flashlight and pointed it at the door. Nothing happened. Then, without warning, a deafening clang reverberated through the ship, the sound of something heavy falling somewhere below deck. The vibration rattled through the floor, knocking his flashlight from his hand. It rolled across the metal surface, its beam swinging wildly before settling on the far wall. The door was still closed. The hum was louder now, rising to a low roar. The ship groaned around him, the walls flexing as though under pressure. Marcus snatched up the flashlight and bolted from the bridge. The stairwell was darker than ever, the air thick with the smell of ozone and salt. As he descended, the roar grew deafening, but beneath it he heard something else. A chorus of whispers, faint but unmistakable, rising from the depths of the ship. They were not words he could understand, only broken fragments of sound, like wind trapped inside metal pipes. He stumbled into the main corridor, the one lined with passenger cabins. The lights of the emergency system flickered erratically, casting red flashes that painted the walls in pulses. Between flashes, the corridor seemed to stretch, the shadows deepening until they looked almost liquid. He ran past the open doors, past the dining hall where the tables still stood perfectly arranged. The chandelier above swung gently, though no wind moved. He reached the grand staircase that led toward the lower decks. Water was seeping up from below, thin streams cascading over the steps. Each droplet caught the red light, turning the stairwell into a river of blood. He hesitated at the top, torn between the need to escape and the irrational compulsion to see what was happening. If the generators were overloading, if the ship was collapsing under its own corrosion, he needed to know before it sank completely. He descended. The water rose to his ankles, then to his knees. It was warm, too warm, carrying the metallic taste of rust and something else, chemical, bitter, almost electric. The hum vibrated through it, so strong now that he could feel it in his teeth. When he reached the bottom, he saw that the corridor ahead was glowing faintly, a pale light seeping through the seams of the metal walls. It pulsed in rhythm with the hum, synchronized like a heartbeat. He waded forward, each step heavier than the last. The light grew brighter as he approached the cargo hold door. It was wide open. The containers inside glowed faintly under the flickering light, as if something inside them still burned. The air was thick, suffocating. The generator room beyond was alive again, the monitors flashing incomprehensible lines of code, the cables humming with energy. The voice he had heard before returned, repeating the same distorted warning. Do not open. Hold, sealed, contamination risk. He tried to speak into his camera, but the words died in his throat. The lights flickered violently, and the hum shifted again, higher now, sharper, until it became almost unbearable. The metal around him vibrated, the water rippling in concentric circles. Then, from somewhere deep in the ship, a sound like tearing steel echoed through the hull. It was followed by a scream, not human, not animal, but the kind of sound metal makes when it breaks under impossible strain. The lights died instantly, plunging him into blackness. For a few seconds there was nothing but the ringing in his ears. Then he felt movement beside him, a disturbance in the water. He swung the flashlight toward it. The beam caught nothing but swirling sediment, but he felt the current shift again, something brushing lightly against his leg. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, and nearly fell. The camera slipped from his shoulder and splashed into the water. He grabbed it instinctively, clutching it to his chest. The hum subsided, replaced by a slow, rhythmic thudding from deep below, like the pounding of a massive heart. He turned and ran. The stairwell was half flooded now, the water rising faster than seemed possible. He climbed, slipping, gasping, his hands raw from gripping the rail. As he reached the upper deck, lightning flashed outside, illuminating the fog in brilliant white. The thunder that followed shook the ship, and for a brief moment he thought he saw faces in the glass of the corridor windows, faces pale and indistinct, staring out into the storm. He blinked, and they were gone. He stumbled onto the open deck, soaked and shivering. The rain had begun, a fine mist that quickly became a downpour. The ocean beyond was invisible, hidden by the dense fog. The hum had stopped, replaced by the sound of the storm, the wind tearing through the broken railings and open hatches. He dropped to his knees and let the rain wash over him, his body trembling with exhaustion and something deeper, an awareness that the Aurora had not simply malfunctioned, it had awakened. He sat there for what felt like hours, the rain pounding against the deck, the thunder rolling across the sea. The fog glowed faintly each time lightning flashed, and in those brief moments he thought he could see the outlines of the ship shifting, the metal flexing like living skin. The thought made him laugh, a short, hysterical sound swallowed by the storm. He knew he should leave, but his strength was gone. He lay back against the cold steel and closed his eyes. When he woke, the storm had passed. Dawn light filtered through the mist, pale and trembling. He was lying on the deck, drenched and freezing, the camera still clutched in his hands. The hum was gone. The ship was silent again. He stood slowly, every muscle aching, and looked around. The fog was thicker than ever, hiding the jungle, the sea, everything beyond a few feet of the deck. The air smelled of ozone and salt. For a moment, he thought he heard the faint echo of footsteps somewhere inside the ship, but he didn't turn to check. He didn't need to. He made his way down to the beach and the ladder slick under his boots. The world felt hollow, unreal. When his feet touched the sand, he looked back one last time. The Aurora stood motionless in the mist, her silhouette blurred by distance, her windows dark. Yet as he stared, a flicker of light glimmered deep within the hull, just once, faint and brief, like the blink of an eye. Marcus turned away and walked toward his skiff. He would leave this place. He would take the recordings and try to tell someone what he had found, though he doubted anyone would believe him. But as he pushed the small boat toward the water, the low hum returned, so faint he thought at first it was only the sound of the sea. It followed him as he rowed out into the fog, steady and patient, like a heart that refused to stop beating. The sea was still when Marcus rowed away from the island, a vast gray mirror stretching to the horizon. The fog hung low over the water, moving in slow, deliberate coils that swallowed the sound of the oars. Behind him, the Aurora was little more than a shape now, half consumed by the mist, her jagged outline merging with the cliffs and trees that framed the island. The hum had faded at last, though its ghost lingered in his ears, vibrating in the spaces between heartbeats. Every few strokes he stopped to listen, convinced that the sound would rise again from beneath the surface. But all he heard was the soft lap of waves against the skiff and his own uneven breathing. He had expected to feel relief. Instead, the silence pressed down like a weight. It was too complete, too perfect, as if the world itself had paused to watch him leave. His body ached from exhaustion and his hands were raw from gripping the oars, yet he dared not rest. The further he drifted, the more unreal the island seemed, an apparition slowly dissolving into the fog. Still, part of him couldn't shake the certainty that it was watching him go. Hours passed, though he could not tell how many. The sun was hidden behind a solid curtain of gray. His compass had stopped working sometime during the night. The needle spun lazily without direction. He tried to orient himself by the waves, by memory, by instinct, but the ocean around him was a flat and endless plain. Each time he thought he was moving forward, the same strip of pale water unfolded before him. He rowed harder, driven by the animal need to put distance between himself and the island. The oars dipped and rose, the rhythm mechanical, endless, and for a moment he could almost believe that the fog was thickening again behind him, rising like breath from the ship's rusted lungs. By late afternoon, the first gull appeared overhead. It circled once, its cry sharp and distant, then vanished into the mist. The sight filled him with fragile hope. Birds meant land, civilization, escape. He rowed faster, ignoring the pain in his shoulders. Then, far ahead, he saw a darker shape emerging from the haze, a coastline, or so he thought. His pulse quickened. He was almost safe. But as he drew nearer, the shape began to shift, resolving into a mass of twisted metal rising from the water at an unnatural angle. His stomach tightened. The fog parted briefly, and he saw it clearly. It was not land. It was a wreck, an old cargo vessel split in two, its hull blackened by fire. The name on its side was unreadable, erased by years of salt and wind. It had run aground on a shallow reef, its rusted ribs exposed like the bones of some colossal animal. Marcus stared, unable to look away. The sea was littered with smaller debris, fragments of wood, a broken life raft, a child's shoe. He realized then that the Aurora was not alone. The ocean here was a graveyard. He drifted closer until the boat bumped gently against the wreck's side. The air smelled of oil and decay. Seaweed draped the exposed beams, swaying with the tide. He reached out and touched the hull, the metal rough beneath his fingers. It felt cold, too cold. When he pulled his hand back, his fingertips were coated with a thin film of gray residue, the same that had clung to his skin on the Aurora. He stared at it for a long moment, his mind racing. Was it coincidence? Or had whatever infected the cruise liner spread across the sea, leaving silent carcasses in its wake? He pushed away from the wreck and rowed on, his movements slower now. The fog thickened again, curling around the skiff like a living thing. Soon the wreck was gone from sight, swallowed whole. The silence returned, heavier than before. Marcus began talking aloud just to hear a human voice. He spoke of nothing in particular. Snatches of memory, fragments of the journey, the names of places he had not seen in years. His voice sounded strange, small, like an echo from someone else's throat. As evening fell, the fog began to glow faintly with the reflection of unseen light. He turned, squinting into the mist. At first, he thought it was the sunset breaking through. But then the glow intensified, pulsing softly, the color shifting from pale yellow to a deep, impossible blue. The same shade he had seen in the Aurora's lower decks, radiating from the generators that should not have been running. The sight froze him. The light seemed to move beneath the surface of the water now, flowing like veins through the sea itself. He held his breath. The boat rocked gently, the water around it rippling with faint luminescence. A low vibration followed, distant yet familiar, the hum, softer this time, but steady. It came from below, from the depths. Marcus gripped the sides of the skiff, his heart pounding. The sound rose and fell in waves, matching the rhythm of his pulse. Then, just as suddenly, it faded, leaving only the faint shimmer of blue light beneath the waves. He leaned over the edge, peering into the depths. Something was down there, far below, something vast and slow-moving. He caught glimpses of geometric shapes, straight lines and corners where none should exist, like the outline of another ship resting on the sea floor. He sat back quickly, breathing hard. He didn't dare look again. Whatever had taken hold of the Aurora had spread farther than he could imagine. Maybe it wasn't just a single ship lost to greed and secrecy. Maybe the entire ocean floor was littered with vessels carrying their own poisoned cargoes, each one leaking its silence into the world above. The thought sent a chill through him that no warmth could ease. He rode through the night. The fog did not lift, but the sea remained calm, as though watching him go. He drank the last of his water, ate the final crumbs from his pack, and forced himself to keep moving. When dawn came, it brought no color, only a dim whitening of the mist. He could no longer tell if he was moving towards safety or simply deeper into the void. By the third day he was drifting. The oars lay across his knees, his hands blistered and bleeding. He slept in short bursts, waking each time to the same gray emptiness. Once he thought he heard the faint sound of engines in the distance, human, mechanical, but when he called out, the sound vanished, leaving only his echo. He began to wonder if he had ever left the island at all, or if the fog had simply wrapped around him, drawing him into some endless circle. On the morning of the fourth day, he spotted a dark shape on the horizon. This time it did not change. As he approached, he saw the faint outline of docks, cranes, and rooftops. Land. Real land. The sight brought tears to his eyes. He rowed the last distance with what little strength remained, the skiff scraping against the wooden pylons of a small port. The place looked abandoned. No voices, no movement, only the soft creak of ropes and the slap of water against hulls. He dragged himself onto the pier and collapsed, the boards rough beneath his palms. When he finally stood, his legs trembling, he realized the port was not deserted after all. A handful of fishing boats floated nearby, their hulls rusted but intact. A single warehouse stood open at the far end of the dock. He stumbled toward it, calling out. His voice echoed through the empty air. Inside, the place smelled of salt and fuel. Old nets hung from the walls and a radio sat on a wooden table, its power light glowing faintly. He turned the dial. Static filled the room. Then, amid the noise, a voice broke through, faint, distant, speaking in a language he couldn't understand. He adjusted the frequency. The voice vanished, replaced by a new sound. 3 short pulses, followed by 2 long ones. The same pattern he had heard in the Aurora's hold. The same impossible rhythm that had echoed through the ship like a heartbeat. He froze, staring at the radio. The pulses repeated again, and again. He slammed his hand down on the power switch, cutting the sound. The silence that followed was deafening. His body shook with exhaustion and fear. He needed to get away, to find people, to tell someone what he had seen before it all vanished like a dream. But as he turned toward the door, something caught his eye. A newspaper lay on the floor beside an overturned crate, its pages yellowed and brittle. He picked it up. The date at the top read December the 22nd, 2010. The headline was in Russian. He could read only part of it. Tourist ship missing at sea, no survivors expected. Beneath it was a photograph. The name painted across the ship's hull was unmistakable. Aurora. He let the paper fall from his hands. The air in the warehouse felt suddenly thin. He stumbled outside, the world spinning around him. The fog had rolled back in, thicker than before, erasing the horizon. The docks, the boats, even the sea seemed to fade into it. He could no longer tell where the water ended and the sky began. The hum returned, so faint it might have been imagined, rising through the wooden planks beneath his feet. He turned in a slow circle, searching for its source, but there was nothing, only the endless gray. He walked back toward the skiff, though he couldn't say why. The fog swallowed him in moments. Each step sounded distant, disconnected, as if he were walking through someone else's dream. The hum grew louder, pulsing now with the rhythm of his heartbeat. Then came another sound, faint but distinct, the slow creak of metal, far away yet all around. He stopped and looked up. Through the fog, high above the water, he thought he saw a shape moving, massive, silent, impossible. For an instant, he glimpsed the outline of a ship's hull suspended in the mist, its name faintly visible through the vapor. Aurora. The letters glowed softly, the metal beneath them slick with condensation. Marcus blinked. The shape was gone, only the fog remained, and the sea whispering beneath it. He sank to his knees, gripping the edge of the dock, staring into the water. His reflection wavered there, fractured by ripples. Beneath it, faint and blurred, something else moved, a reflection that wasn't his own. A shadow, deeper than the sea itself, stretching far below where light could not reach. For a long time he stayed like that, unmoving, listening to the pulse that seemed to echo from within the depths. Then, slowly, he stood. The fog pressed close around him, cold and wet, wrapping him in its silence. He picked up the camera, the one object that had followed him through everything. The battery light still glowed faintly. He raised it, pointed it toward the sea, and pressed record. His voice was quiet, almost calm. This is Marcus Hale. If anyone ever finds this recording, the ship is real. It's still there. It never sank. Don't look for it. Don't go near it. Leave it where it lies. He lowered the camera. The red light blinked once, then died. The fog shifted again, thickening until even the water disappeared. The hum grew softer, fading into the distance. And when it finally stopped, there was nothing left but the sea, the mist, and the silence, endless, waiting, complete. Far behind him, invisible beneath the waves, the Aurora rested in her grave of rust and coral. The faint glow of her emergency lights pulsed in the darkness, steady and eternal, like the heartbeat of something that would never truly die. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to subscribe for more mysterious discoveries waiting to be uncovered. Don't leave yet. Check out the next video for another unbelievable case, and share this one with someone who